The American Messianic Jewish congregational movement, as we know it today, blossomed in the 1960s and 70s. These young congregations borrowed theological ideas from Judaism and from Christianity, but comparatively little work has been done to synthesize a truly original, authentic, relevant, and beautiful Messianic Jewish theology. Our guest today, Dr. Richard Harvey, is the only person in the world with a Ph.D. in Messianic Jewish theology, and he's here to talk about how far Messianic Jews have come and how far they have yet to go as they attempt to articulate their most deeply cherished beliefs in a rigorous and systematic way.
Put your hand in mine together. We will walk in harmony. Let me introduce you to my teacher, the rabbi from the Galilee.
You're listening to Messiah Podcast, where Jesus is Jewish, and that changes everything. Messiah Podcast is a production of First Fruits of Zion. Well, all the way from England, it's Messianic Jewish scholar Dr. Richard Harvey. Welcome to Messiah Podcast.
Thanks. Great to be with you.
So we love Messianic Jewish PhDs here at First Fruits of Zion. Every one of them is precious to us, and we love it when we encourage Messianic Jews who can to go get an education and contribute to the robustification of the movement and its theology. So maybe as an inspiration to those out there who are considering this path. First of all, how did you land in Messianic Judaism? And then what inspired you to strive for that pinnacle of the doctoral degree?
Wow, thank you. Well, I started because I'm Jewish. I'm brought up Jewish. In England, we call it liberal. In America, it's the Reform synagogue. My family my father's side are German Jews. My mother's side are Polish Jews. My wife, who's also Jewish, her family are Russian Polish. So I was brought up in the UK. We went to synagogue, but I didn't really believe in God, and I began a spiritual search. This was back in the 1970s, so probably before your time. But I was searching for truth, for God, for love. I had two friends, these types, born-again Christians. They claimed to have a personal relationship with God through Yeshua, through Jesus. I spent 3 years trying to prove them wrong. The more I tried to prove them wrong, the more I saw they were probably right. And when they asked me what I thought happened when Yeshua, Jesus, died on the cross, why were the disciples so transformed that first Easter weekend, I had what I could only describe now as a vision. I saw an empty tomb. This was in broad daylight. It was sitting there eating chocolate cake, drinking coffee with them. I saw an empty tomb, and I realized that Yeshua had risen from the dead. And the English phrase is gobsmacked. I just I didn't know what I was seeing. I said to them, perhaps you're right. Perhaps Jesus did rise from the dead, but I'm Jewish. We're not supposed to believe that. But really, I had to just accept it, and I ended up getting down on my knees and in tears. I asked God to forgive me my sin. I asked Yeshua to come into my life as the one who died on the cross for my sins, and I became a disciple, a Jewish follower of Jesus. I said to a friend at the time, what does it mean that I'm Jewish? And he said, well, that's a gift that God has given you. As you grow in your faith, God will show you. And I think that's really what started me off on a sort of two sides of me, if you like, an intellectual side and an ecstatic or an experience-driven side. I was experiencing the reality of God's presence in my life. I was experiencing the reality of his power. But I was asking a lot of questions, and especially, what does it mean to be Jewish and to believe in Yeshua, in Jesus? Most Christians are not Jewish. Most Jewish people do not believe in Yeshua. So I
Yeah.
ended up studying theology at university, and really that's been a continuing sort of spiritual and intellectual discipline that I've tried to follow as I've grown as a disciple. And the PhD, I didn't really think about that for many years, but I just kept always having books and reading and studying. I got involved in the Messianic movement in 1979. I came out to a Messianic conference in Harrisburg, you know, the one the MJAA conference. And that really gave me and the others, couple of others with us, a sense that we should start a Messianic congregation in London. And we did that in the 1980s and 90s. And as I was doing that, I was also continuously studying. I did my master's in Hebrew and Jewish studies at University College London, very good Department of Jewish Studies there. I said to them, but I'm a believer in Yeshua. Is that okay? And they said, absolutely, because this was the first university that was set up for people who weren't in the Church of England, Catholics, atheists, and Jews. So it always had a tradition of intellectual freedom. And I was able to do my dissertation there under Jewish mysticism scholar Ada Rappaport Albert, and I did it on the topic of medieval Jewish Christian disputations, and in particular a large manual written by a Dominican monk called Raymundus Martini, the Pugio Fidei, the Dagger of Faith, about 1,500 big folio pages, Latin, Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, on how to argue or defeat the arguments of Jews and of Muslims.
Okay.
So, and then really the PhD, a friend of mine said that you either do it when you're young and you get on with life and you get married and you have your dog and you get your qualifications, or you do it later in life. And I actually did it, you know, relatively late in life, but it was already my passion to try and understand theologically what Messianic Jews are doing and saying in their lives and in their theology. And having been around the Messianic movement in UK, in Israel, and in America, I was really just listening to all my different friends and trying to write down what they were saying in a coherent way on the key building blocks of Jewish theology, God, Torah, and Israel. And then I tried to describe this theologically and understand where they were coming from and where they were heading. But PhD just stands for patience, humility, and discipline. You have to be willing to just go on a long haul, but it's a great joy because you get to focus on a particular thing that you're interested in.
Yeah. That's I got a little tiny taste of that getting my master's, because I could decide what I was going to write a paper about within some broad parameters, and so I was just exploring the Paul and Judaism school, even at a conservative Baptist seminary. They were fine with it as long as I cited all my sources and didn't say anything heretical. So,
well, a master's is like a little taste of doing your own research. And they say when you do a bachelor's, you know nothing about everything. When you do a master's, you know something about something. And when you do a PhD, you know everything about nothing, because what you study is so small and specialized, although obviously Messianic Judaism and Messianic Jewish theology in our stream, it's something that a lot of people are interested in, but it's a very niche subject academically, and probably there's only a few people in the world, David Rudolph, Mark Kinzer, Jen Rosner, only a few of us who have really specialized. And even my Messianic Jewish friends, they tend to do their doctorates in biblical studies or something like that. So I think I'm the
Sure.
only person that's got a PhD in Messianic Jewish theology. Not that
Wow.
that's saying anything. Yeah.
But it says, I think it says a lot. You know, there's something about specialization. I'm all for it. The sliver that you focused on, that narrow specialization that you did your dissertation on, was mapping Messianic Jewish theology, which I think is a great metaphor, because it seems like there's a lot of it, and I think it's great because people have, you know, Dan Cohn-Sherbach has this great book about Messianic Judaism, but to have a Messianic Jew, a person of faith in Yeshua, and also a Jewish person who sees the value in Judaism and Jewish identity and Jewish thought and Jewish customs, to have someone with like skin in the game, right? To have someone who cares about it, like you talked about, not just the intellectual interest, but your experience and your encounter with God informing all of this. I think that's great. I think necessary, and it's really fascinating to me that you exist. So I want to give you a chance or an opportunity to tell us, like, what did you find as you were doing this research for your dissertation? What does the map of Messianic Jewish theology look like?
Yeah, well, Michael Schiffman, who's, you may know, Messianic Jewish leader in the States, when he saw the book and I gave him a copy, because he's in it, and just about any Messianic Jewish leader who's written and who's addressed themselves to the Messianic movement, not just to the wider Christian world, is in it. And he said to me when he saw the book and read it, he said, it's like, now I know where I belong in the neighborhood. So the Messianic Jewish world, theologically, it's like a neighborhood, and there's different districts or areas. I particularly wanted Dan Cohn-Sherbach. You mentioned him. He's a Reform rabbi, and he supervised my thesis. He'd written the book on Messianic Judaism, mainly looking at its history and its practices. So when I said to him, well, I want to do it on the theology, he said, that's interesting. Is there a theology? And of course, where you have two Jews, you have three opinions. And where you have Messianic Jews, you have many different opinions. But I wanted to try and get them to talk to each other across their own boundaries. Because again, we've had things like the Borough Park consultations, and now a number of books that are composite books of different Messianic Jews talking with each other. But I don't think anybody had really tried to draw them together in basic theological discussion. So I organized it by looking at the traditional Jewish ways of doing theology, looking at God, Torah, and Israel. And for me, that broke down into doctrine of God, who is Hashem. How do we understand the unity of God? And then doctrine of Yeshua, who is Messiah? How do we understand Yeshua as fully human, fully divine, fully Jewish, fully eternal Son of God? And that was the God side. Then the Torah, again, I just broke it down into Torah in theory and Torah in practice. What are the different theoretical understandings that Messianic Jews had? I found that 3 of the 8 types were what I called Torah negative. They were not that keen on keeping Torah unless it was very clearly also in the Brit Hadashah, and unless it was clearly a cultural and national thing to do, and not just because you were following Rabbinic Judaism. Those were the Torah negative streams in the Messianic movement. But the majority of streams I found were positive, from Dan Juster, David Stern, Joe Shulam, John Fisher, Mark Kinzer, Zvi Sadan, etc. And they went from being basically positive to being very, very positive, and understanding Torah in a different range of ways, some primarily the 5 books of Moses in the Hebrew Bible, but others the whole of rabbinic tradition, taken from a very orthodox or even ultra-orthodox perspective. And then the third category was Israel. And in fact, the big questions are, who is Israel? How do you become part of Israel? And what is the future of Israel? What do you say about Israel in prophecy and eschatology? It was a lot to survey. And you asked me, what did I discover? I discovered that there is a coherent Messianic Jewish theology, even a coherent Messianic Jewish theological tradition that we're all, like the rabbis, part of, but we all argue with each other. And the two basic ground, or what I call the epistemic foundations, the ground of understanding, is number one, the ongoing election of Israel, the Jewish people, and number two, the messiahship of Yeshua. And as long as you affirm those two core affirmations, there's actually quite a lot of variety. And there's even people on the fringes that I don't like the words orthodoxy and heresy, because that's really too narrow and too limiting a way of discussing it. We don't really have those categories in Judaism or Messianic Judaism in quite the same way. But certainly if you hold to those epistemic foundations, the ongoing election of Israel and the messiahship of Yeshua, there is room for a wide diversity on exactly what that meant. For example, on the doctrine of Yeshua, some Messianic Jews do not want to affirm the deity of Messiah, and they're normally seen as on the fringe or off the radar. But I found, no, they love Yeshua, they just don't want to say it in that way. And David Starr would be one of those who was reluctant to assent to creeds, even though he would be believing in that.
I think that's fascinating, because when you undertake this, there's different approaches you could take, and you assess a lot of them in your dissertation, in your book, and some of them you just come out and say, like, well, this person really made the attempt, but they didn't really seriously consider both faith traditions. It's just Christianity with a talit, or it's just Judaism, and when you say Yeshua every so often throughout the synagogue liturgy. But to come up with something that's more robust than that, you could see where you'd have to go all the way back. Like, you'd have to be picking apart all of history and say, well, where did they diverge, and how could we bring it back together? And you would look at the creeds and say, well, is that how much do we need that? Or do we have to say it in exactly that way?
Yeah. It sort of shows that the modern Messianic movement is like trying to build something new, but it's actually building on quite old traditions and resources. And that's why one of the main focuses of my dissertation, and really now one of my main theological interests, is the way Mark Kinzer has developed his understanding of the relationship between the church and Israel in what he calls bilateral ecclesiology. But also it seems he's doing something even more ambitious. He's trying to recalibrate or reconceptualize the relationships between Judaism and Christianity. So I think he's doing a sort of what I'd call a binocular theology, not just a bilateral ecclesiology of where we are in the body of Messiah, but also where in the purposes of God we understand the relationship to be between these, if you like, Siamese twins, or this fractious relationship between the Jewish world and the Christian world. And in his book, Besorah and Jerusalem Crucified, he talks about the fractured gospel. And to me now, it seems that there is a a fracturing of what would then become Judaism and would become Christianity, which in the purposes of Hashem was not the ideal, to put it lightly. And that means that we're trying to do theology that is fully Jewish and fully believing in Yeshua, recognizing, like you did with your Paul within Judaism studies, that really we need to read scripture in a different way. And we need to read from within Judaism as well as from within Christianity, if you like.
Yeah. And I appreciate it, Dr. Kinzer's, in the beginning of post-missionary Messianic Judaism, when he talks about, like sort of the guardrails for doing theology and what's going to inform your theology. And he says, history can inform your theology. Like if you look back, as you look back through history, a bunch of things happen, like these things that happened you might find that they validate or invalidate some of the things you might want to say theologically. And so I think for him, I can't speak for him, but to see the church is here and Israel is here, this must be from God, and we must look at both traditions, and so he has an immense respect for Christian tradition. He has immense respect for Jewish tradition, and we love that. We love Dr. Kinzer and his approach. We find it interesting. It's not exactly the same as our approach, and our approach kind of reminds me when I was reading your book on Luther, and at the end you had this sort of what if section where you're like, what can we imagine a world in which Martin Luther had 5 more theses that affirmed the ongoing election of the Jewish people? Or what if he had responded differently to the Jewish community and had fostered a good relationship with them? What if even he had just recanted his anti-Semitic views on his deathbed? Like, where would we be today? How would it change the world we live in today? And that's like, and you say over and over, like, this is a wild dream, but it's worth thinking about. It's a mental exercise that could be helpful as we look at reconciliation, right? And I think for us at First Fruit Design, our wild dream is sort of like, what if the church had never developed an ecclesiology exclusive of Israel? Like, what if the church had always affirmed Israel's ongoing election? What if the church had always affirmed, like, the positive statements about the Torah that we find in the New Testament? And so what if the replacement theology, the supersessionism, the triumphalism, and these anti-Semitic attitudes had never formed in the church? Like, what would the theology have looked like? Would it have turned out the same? Like, how much of Christian theology is reactionary, so to speak, and developed in order to exclude the Judaism and Jewish people? And that's sort of our starting point. It's like, what if it had always just been Judaism?
Well, that's
which
great.
It's not the same, but
yeah. Well, it's lovely to hear you say that, because to me, 2 of the great things for doing theology, number one is empathy, and the other is imagination. And especially in our streams, we often focus on the negative things that we're trying to correct and disagree with. Whereas if you allow for a leap of the imagination, what if? And when I get to heaven, I want to dance with Martin Luther. I want to dance an Israeli horror, and I want to drink a good German beer with him. But in order for that to happen, he needs to have repented, and I need to have forgiven him for the things he said about Jews and Judaism. But the way that you're saying, FFOZ is trying to state a sort of ideal positive position, I think that's really why we do theology. And one of my themes is to accentuate the positive. I'm trying to find a rigorous, robust, post-supersessionist Messianic Jewish theology of the church and Israel that allows me to not only be fully Jewish and fully believing in Yeshua, but to see myself as part of a group that should never have really been divided, which includes Israel and the nations. And when I wrote the book on Luther, which was really coming out of my own sense of pain, because I saw this horrific, absolutely insulting statue on the wall of Luther's home church. It's called the
Yeah.
Judensaal, the Jew pig. It has young
Yeah.
Jews sucking the nipples of a pig. It's a sculpture on the wall of the church, and a rabbi with his hand up the backside of the pig. And Luther, in his book Von Shem Hamforash, on the fully explained or fully articulated name of God, says that this is where the rabbis get their Talmud from the back of a pig. And of course, this is anti-Semitism is a bit of an anachronistic term, but it's so anti-Jewish, both theologically and ethnically, saying Jews not welcome here, Jews Christ killers, Jews condemned to wander the earth as reluctant witnesses of the truth of Protestantism or Christianity. So I firstly wept, and then I poured out my heart to God, and then I began imagining the what ifs. And when I meet my friends who are German Lutherans and others who also feel the same sort of burden of history, it gives us an opportunity to look forward positively to what reconciliation might look like. And so I agree with you. It's good to have that positive emphasis in a forward-looking way. And for me, all theology is done in a historical context. And I agree with Mark. We have to learn from history and try and avoid making some of the mistakes and try and do it better the next time.
Yeah. And it seems, this is just off the top of the head and from my heart. But, it just seems to get there and to get the theology. Sometimes thinking about it, it seems like just not something someone can do right now. Maybe it's a multi-generational journey, right?
Yeah, you see, I think that we all do theology in just practical ways in what we say and how we live. Some of us do it as an academic discipline where you actually have to write it down. But I used, and Dan Cohn-Sherbock sort of thought this was a good way of doing it. When I was trying to map Messianic Jewish theology, I wasn't asking exactly what is true and what is false. I was looking at the aesthetics of the system. Is it beautiful? Is it authentic? Is it coherent? Is it in touch with its community? And has it got contemporary relevance? And I used another Jewish theologian called Baron Sherwin, who developed that as a way of evaluating, Jewish theologies. So for me, because we live in so many different contexts and we all have different types of theological concerns, Israel, America, Britain, Europe, we're all in our own historical and cultural contexts. Theology, if you like, is us trying to, it's faith-seeking understanding. It's trying to put into words and understand and explain to others how we believe in Hashem, how we accept Yeshua, what that means for us in our communities, and how we live. But there's no one perfect theology. We're all just trying to do it the best way we can. For me, it's an act of worship as well. It's like the worship of God with our minds. And so we aspire to it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. We aspire to it. We aspire to theology. Hey, just wanted to take a second here to remind you that when you like, comment, and subscribe, YouTube is more likely to recommend this video to other people. And the more the channel grows, the more of a platform we have to be able to invite amazing guests like Dr. Harvey, giving you the opportunity to hear how the Jewish Jesus is changing lives across the globe. So please smash that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel. These little steps have a big effect in spreading the message of the Jewish Jesus and his kingdom to as large an audience as possible. Thanks. So, since you did, you're still like involved in Messianic Judaism. You're involved with many different organizations and have been involved with a lot of different organizations. So, having continued to survey the field since you wrote the dissertation, has anything changed? Has there been new developments, or do you see the movement as a whole moving in any particular direction?
That's a great question. I found 8 types of Messianic Jewish theology when that was about 20 years ago. I think there's a couple more types that have emerged, and some streams have grown and others have declined a bit. But in general, I think we're in our third generation or second or third generation of the modern Messianic movement. Um,
Hmm.
the movement in Israel has a different flavor and shape to the
Yeah, I've
movement
heard
in
that.
the United States. In Israel, it's more Israeli Christianity, if you like. It's a sort of national, cultural, linguistic type of Jewish believers in Yeshua. But in especially diaspora and America, it's a more religiously observant type of Messianic Judaism.
Hmm.
I think theologically, another stream emerged because one of the people I wrote about then proclaimed that they didn't believe in the full humanity of Yeshua, but only of his full deity, which is what we used to
Wow.
call docetism, that
Yeah.
he wasn't truly human. Now, most Jewish believers in Yeshua go the other way, that he's not
Yeah.
truly divine. So I'm
Yeah.
afraid that's a new stream that has emerged, not a big stream, but a new stream. I think that
Wow.
the streams within the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council, Mark Kinzer and others, has grown into more of a tradition because of the work of the MJTI, the Messianic Jewish Theological Institute, the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council, the number of students that have been through those programs. I think some 20 or 30 maybe Messianic rabbis are closely associated with that group. I think that's the most significant theological stream. But then within both the MJAA, the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America, and the UMJC, the number of congregations has grown and the number of Messianic rabbis has grown. For me, I think the big theological challenge, actually, I've just written an article for the an online encyclopedia on this. Obviously, the Israel-Gaza war and how we deal with that theologically. At the moment, we're all still going through the deep trauma of it. And of course, many of us have family and friends, and in Israel, people, whole community just stricken with the trauma of what the events are. But if
Hmm.
it anything to go by, this sort of reflection that took place after the Second World War and also after the First World War, interestingly enough, this really it catapulted theological reflection into a new set of problems. Jürgen
Yeah.
Moltmann, theology of the cross and the resurrection of Yeshua and how he applied that to the end of the Second World War. Post-Holocaust theology developed. Now, it's not quite the same thing, but certainly, as I'm sure you're aware, this has been in my lifetime and in my children and my grandchildren's lifetime the most significant events since the Holocaust occurred. And I don't see many Messianic Jews yet even really articulating what that means for us theologically. It's obviously about the theology of suffering, but it's also about a theology of justice and peace and reconciliation. And I think that's going to be a major challenge in the days to come, especially for my brothers and sisters in Israel. I think then we also have a more ecumenical form of Messianic Judaism. And in my book, I sort of highlighted that some Messianics were what I called ecumessianic, that they were willing to talk to Roman Catholics, that they were willing to jump into this field of Jewish-Christian relations in a way that many Messianic Jews would say, no, we're not part of the church. That's not us. We just totally disassociate ourselves from it. But I think
Yeah.
those two streams are probably both developing in different ways. And I've had the privilege of being with Mark Kinzer and others, meeting with Roman Catholics, simply trying to say, can you be Jewish and believe in Yeshua and be a Roman Catholic and still continue to live as a Jew? And that to me seems to be the nub of the issue of what the Catholic Church now wants to say, if anything, about how it relates to Israel and how it relates to Jews who become Catholics who want to continue to live as Jews, and how it relates to the Messianic movement. I think that's a growing area in Messianic Judaism as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's fascinating. You know, it's easy to hole up and say, we're going to figure this thing out ourselves. But I think, you know, in my eyes, part of what gives a movement legitimacy is if it can stand on its own 2 feet and talk to other kinds of people, right? If you can't talk to anybody, then it looks weird. It feels weak. So we started doing reaction videos.
I don't think we can avoid it, but I think it's often our own posture about it's sort of, we're having to defend ourselves against a much larger group out there. And I really don't think that's how it looks these days. And I always thought this, you know, when I was a young disciple of Yeshua, but I couldn't express it because we didn't have, you know, Paul within Judaism, Jesus within Judaism. We didn't have the ways that never parted, a whole new way of thinking about the ongoing presence of Jewish believers in Yeshua in history. And we didn't have a sense of the ongoing election of Israel in mainstream Christian theology to a large extent. But we have that today. And we also have this very critical position, being Jewish and part of the body of Messiah. We're there to represent Israel and the Jewish people as well. So I think you're right, Jacob, that a lot of Messianic Jews fell on the defensive about this. But now I think we can say in a positive way, no, this is good news. It's really part of the whole Besorah, the good news of Hashem, of God, for Israel and all nations. And it sort of reintegrates elements of the gospel that have been in a way separated by the division and the parting of the ways.
Yeah, yeah. I remember talking with Dr. Kinzer about that when he came on. When they with the split between Judaism and Christianity, each took something valuable. And if you want, you know, the Messianic Judaism represents an opportunity to put it back together, right? To restore something, and that's exciting. I think it should be exciting for every follower of Jesus. Like, that's exciting. You can get something back that was lost. The healing of the relationship as well. I mean, there's a lot of dimensions to this, and it seems, you know, I was born in 1985, so all this stuff's happening before I was born. But just from my retrospective view, just only being informed by people I've talked to and things I've read, it seems like a lot of stuff sort of happened at once, right? You have the Holocaust, you have the Dead Sea Scrolls get discovered, you have the state of Israel being established. All this happens very rapidly. And then you have everyone starts talking about it. And so you have post-Holocaust theology, and it takes 30 years or so for E.P. Sanders to write Paul and Palestinian Judaism. But there's other, you know, Davies is out there and Dalby is out there. There's these guys like just poking at the problem and you know, wrestling with the implications of all of this. And the Messianic Jewish congregational movement, arises in that context, in the context of a post-Holocaust theology. Like there's Messianic Jewish people before that. There's in the 19th century and so forth. But the congregational movement that most people think of when they think of Messianic Judaism, at least in America, is a product of, I don't know, like the 60s and 70s. And it seems like you might be the one to ask, what happened? Like how did all that happen? What were the streams that fed into that? What were the conditions under which this movement coalesced, and who are sort of the major players? Like how did this all happen?
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting listening to you. You're born in 1985. So you're 29 years younger than me, I think. I was born in 1956. But I was fortunate that I actually knew and met those people you've just mentioned. So I
Wow.
did meet E.P. Sanders because he was dating my New Testament professor at university. I did
Good for
meet
him.
W.D. Davis because he came and gave a lecture on Jewish sources of the Gospel of Matthew at my university. I went up to him with my copy of the background of the Sermon on the Mount. I
Yeah, I
asked him
have
to
that.
sign it. He gave it me, and I said I was a Jewish disciple of Yeshua. He said, "Oh, how wonderful!" He put a Hebrew inscription in it. And I also met David Dauber in America, in Berkeley,
Wow.
because he had influenced a friend of mine, Eric Lipson, who had trained as a rabbi and then became a believer in Yeshua, did our wedding.
Wow.
And I met Dauber, and he said to me, because I introduced myself as a Jewish disciple of Yeshua, he said, oh, yes, that's very nice. My wife is also a believer in Jesus. And I said to him, oh, well, have
Wow.
you thought about that? He said, well, I'm very sympathetic, but I don't think I could take that position. He was in his 90s then.
Hmm.
So two things to observe. One is when you meet these people, you become part of a tradition of scholarship and of the development of thought. The other is that we're all just links in a chain, and we're all just, it gives you a perspective on things. So the question you've asked about the relative newness of the Messianic movement and the way that we don't always have a focus on our forerunners and predecessors. I think for me, when I became a believer in Yeshua, I met these very old gentlemen and ladies who'd become believers before the Second World War. I met Harcourt Samuel, who was assisting in the International Hebrew Christian Alliance first meeting in 1925. Mark Kagan was 100 years old, still preaching and going strong. And I stepped into a long history of what was called Hebrew Christianity.
Yeah.
And as I write about this now, and I know you at First Fruits of Zion are very interested in these luminaries like
Oh yeah.
Polyak and Levertov, and actually there's so many of them. And
Yeah.
I'm trying to write now a short sort of overview of Hebrew Christians, Jewish believers in Yeshua in the 19th and 20th centuries. And they were often far more Jewish and in many ways far more believing in Yeshua than many of us because of the backgrounds they came from. They spoke the languages, they were immersed in their own Jewish traditions. And then often they became very, very Christian, and they didn't really have a Messianic Jewish option. But if you look at their lives and the way they constructed their identities, they're working with the same sort of elements: Jewish ethnicity, Jewish culture, their family connections. And then the theology hadn't really developed as it has today. They hadn't had the Jewish reclamation of Jesus that came in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And of course, Jews and Christians didn't really talk to each other or get on with each other very well.
Yeah.
So, what's the lesson for us in the Messianic movement? Nothing new under the sun. We're just reinventing ourselves in every generation. But we do have greater freedom because of those things you mentioned. The after the Holocaust, the reestablishment of the State of Israel, the rediscovery of the Jewishness of Jesus, changing posture from many churches has meant that Jewishness is not something you had to give up when you became a believer in Yeshua.
Yeah. I think it was, it reminds me, I'm not quite sure why, but you contributed to this collection of essays in honor of Mark Kinzer. And you talked about this guy, Mark John Levy. And he was going around trying to get people to adopt this resolution. Then Jews can just keep being Jews. And then they can celebrate their holidays and their customs and everything like that. And he was able to get like the evangelicals to sign off on it. And then he took it to the Hebrew Christian Alliance. And they're like, no, we don't want this.
Yeah. Well, the good thing about him is he never gave up trying.
He kept bringing it back.
He was voted unanimously that his proposals, which were not that radical, it was that Jews who believe in Yeshua should be free to continue to observe Shabbat, kosher. That was basically it. The Anglican or the Episcopalian Church passed that as a motion in their General Assembly. But the Hebrew Christian Alliance of America and the International Alliance completely rejected it out of hand. I think one lady agreed with him at one of the meetings. But he didn't do it in a political way. He just did it from his own sort of heartfelt concern that Jews who believed in Yeshua should be free to continue to do this. And what I did in the essay in the Festschrift for Mark Kinzer, I said, how does he fit the 5 points of Kinzerism, the 5 basic principles that Mark Kinzer advocates for post-Messianic Judaism? And I found that Levy fitted about 3 out of 5 of them, but he wasn't that in sympathy with Rabbinic Judaism. And so he actually objected to quite a lot of rabbinic thinking as well. But he, like Levertov, like Margoliouth, like others who we're not that familiar with, were definitely trying to maintain what it meant to be Jewish and as a believer in Yeshua. And he was a gracious, sweet, gentle guy, a poet, a traveler. He went backwards and forwards across the Atlantic to try and form the International Hebrew Christian Alliance, to get the Americans and the British to organize a big conference in 1925 for international Jewish believers in Jesus. So he was definitely a forerunner, but like many, he was the early ripe fruits. That's what they called Rabinowitz as well, that it might not have been the right time, but he still was there and he was willing to be isolated and in a minority.
Yeah. And then what was it? Was it one or two generations later? You have the Hebrew Christian Alliance of America becoming the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America. So the fruit ripened. It just took a little while.
Exactly. And in my view, and again, this is my particular view, that the dualism, the sort of false dichotomy that was there in the 1970s, where you're either a Hebrew Christian in a church or a Messianic Jew in a Messianic congregation, today, that's not quite how we define ourselves. And the surveys I've done now say that most Jewish disciples of Yeshua are happy to call themselves Messianic Jews, even if they're in mainstream churches. And in fact, the term Hebrew Christian, which was the most popular term for about 200 years, has now fallen out of use to a large extent. Of course, when they used the term Hebrew Christian, they were actually being very Jewish. They were saying, I'm still part of my Hebrew identity. They didn't want to use the word Jewish because it sounded like Judaism. going back under the law for them. But and in many contexts, they just talked about Hebrew language, Hebrew culture. But the Hebrew Christian movement was a resurgence of Jewish identity within Christianity. And again,
Yeah.
it faced some of the same obstacles that the Messianic movement has faced.
Yeah. 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 It makes me think of Daniel Zion. The churches would come to him and try to get him to become a missionary, and he's like, "You guys got this wrong. I'm like pro Judaism. I want Jews to keep being Jewish, practicing Judaism. I'm not going to try to convert them to a different religion. I don't want to convert to a different religion. I just want to be Jewish and follow Jesus." We love these guys and their stories because they are all different. You know, you have from Daniel Zion, who's just like, I'm going to just keep being a rabbi, to Paul Philip Levertov, who's like, I'm going to become an Anglican priest. And just the way that they negotiated those social identities is fascinating, because they both did retain this deep respect for Judaism and this deep attachment to Yeshua, and just the different ways that played out. I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of questions here about, if you like, Messianic Jewish identity. And in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, I think that there was far more pressure for Jews who believed in Yeshua to step into the Christian world, and they didn't really know how to retain their Jewish side. So some of them, like Lucky, for example, they live a sort of dual life. They live as an Orthodox Jew in Orthodox circles, and they live as Christian missionaries as well. And then others like Liechtenstein, they choose not to be baptized, and they continue to practice as rabbis, even though the court of the rabbis in Hungary tried to get them to recant and everything. And then there are others like Rabinovitz, we mentioned, who he gets baptized, but not under any one group. So no one can claim responsibility. He's baptized in, I think, a Moravian church by a congregational minister, and he's got connections with Lutherans. But he's really like this Haskalah enlightened reformer in the Jewish community, who then becomes an out and out evangelist. He wants a train to go around Russia where he can share his testimony and distribute literature. So, yeah, the modern Messianic movement, we've got as much variety. We probably have more numbers than they did then, but we're not as well educated. I think that's a concern. So how we do it today and tomorrow is it's a good question.
Yeah, no, I think that the Messianic Jewish Theological Institute, like you said, and the Rabbinical Council. I mean, that's to have something formal, something structured for people to go through. You know, and not having to cobble together an education in order to lead a Messianic Jewish congregation. I think that having that structure forming is going to be helpful, and it's going to contribute to the longevity and robustness of the movement. But yeah, for all the Messianic Jews out there listening, you know, go get an education. We need it.
Yeah,
Don't just be a follower, be a leader. Come on.
Well, I think, yes, the rabbis say, find yourself a fellow disciple and find yourself a teacher. And I think that's the good thing you mentioned about MJTI and the different groups. And there are many programs out there. And for me, the externality of having other people marking my homework, so I'm not marking my own homework, and being accountable to my peers, you know, at what I'm writing and what I'm teaching, and then how people are growing. So I'm sure you have mentors, and I'm sure you're on a track of your own in your studies. And some of us are autodidacts. We teach ourselves, but we often then have sort of eccentric ways of doing things. Others, if you go through the formal tracks, it gives you a more sort of consolidated approach. But Yeah, my hope for the Messianic movement is that we grow to both spiritual and theological maturity. So the spiritual maturity comes from what Sherwin calls authenticity. And by that, he means authenticity to the traditions that we're part of and authentic in ourselves. And being a disciple, which is, my preferred way of calling myself now, is I'm just a Jewish disciple of Yeshua. It means I have so much to learn. It means I have to have a humble posture, both inside and outside. And so authenticity is a requirement for good theology and for good discipleship. And if the Messianic movement can mature both theologically and spiritually, then it will grow up and really reach its fullness and its potential. But of course, we have to be careful because in many ways we're still young and weak, and we're also learning and still making lots of mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate what you said about being an autodidact because I was homeschooled for most of my education, and there is a lot of what I have behind me on the wall here is just I'd read a book by David Rudolph or Isaac Oliver or whatever, some Messianic Jewish scholar, Mark Kinzer, and I'd see something that blew my mind, and I'd go to the footnote and be like, that's in that book. So I just go buy it. And so I tried to build a library that made sense based on all these references. But it's nothing like what you have to go through in like a doctoral program where it's really rigorous and you have to learn the languages really well, and you have to the accountability that you talk about. And it's the same in like the Jewish world. If you don't go to yeshiva, you don't have that formal like study. You run up against your own limits. You don't learn to think rigorously enough. So yeah, I think we like it. We want to see people get educated. A lot of people end up over there in England getting educated. I know David Rudolph over there, Joel Willits. I don't think he's Jewish, but he's helpful to Messianic Judaism.
Some of them get good degrees in Oxford and Cambridge, and that gets them good jobs back in the States. So maybe you'll come and do that for your PhD, Jacob, because again, you have to model it for others. Because
physician.
If you're going to be a man in authority, you have to be a man under authority, and you have to allow that externality. Now, don't give yourself excuses that you haven't got time to learn all the languages, or you wouldn't. I mean, we all go through formal and informal ways of learning. And of course, the best form is just one-on-one discipleship, training and mentoring. But the institutional forms, like you do it in Israel or you do it wherever you want to do it, it just harnesses and trains parts of you that are not fully developed. So it's like being apprenticed and having in a guild and becoming a master craftsman. But even then, it's just opening the door to the next set of questions that you're exploring.
Yeah, in some ways, you're just putting together the tools to go out and finally do what it is that you're trying to get done. So I have a last meaty question for you here, which is, and this may be something that you'll find that is different depending on these different streams or these different expressions of Messianic Judaism, these different ways of formulating Messianic Jewish theology, or different systems, different Messianic Jewish theologies. They're going to have different views of like Jewish mysticism. And, my education, like from elementary through high school was independent fundamental Baptist, right? It was a Becca curriculum, and it was very much like, anything that looked like it was from the 60s and 70s, anything that looked like it might be sort of new age mysticism or hippy dippy, anything like I would have got kicked out. I would have got kicked out for having this hair, but they wouldn't have been okay with Jewish mysticism I think just because it looks too similar. It seems like it belongs in the same category as all other mysticism, Hindu mysticism, Buddhist or New Age. Whereas, what I've seen of it, just looking at the little glimpses I've got, because Levertov writes about it, right? And you see it in other places, and some of these luminaries will write about it. Even Daniel Zion wrote about the Kabbalah. I think Lichtenstein has written about it extensively because it was important to them. They thought it was valuable. So, what do you think of Jewish? Like, what you have? I think you said you studied under someone like in your master's program, so you must know a lot about it. You took an interest in it. Like, what's there? What can people expect from it if they start to read about it? And like, what's valuable for a person of faith who's looking at Judaism as like, a tradition that's important and that's helpful in guiding someone on their path of discipleship.
Yeah. Well, I actually think that what you said back there about mysticism in Hinduism or Buddhism, it's important to recognize that all religions, Judaism, Christianity, other religions, have what you could call a mystical tradition. Mysticism, in a general way, is seeking to unite yourself with the divine. And every world religion has this. Judaism has a particular path that developed over thousands of years. And today, Jewish life, Jewish liturgy, the Jewish world is seeped in that mystical tradition, even though we don't realize it. The synagogue prayer book is influenced by Isaac Luria and his Kabbalistic system developed in Safed in the 17th, 15th, terrible at dates, 17th, 16th century, I think, is infuses, the Jewish liturgy. Every time we sing the Adon Olam, we are using a mystical commentary on the unity of God that Maimonides, the rationalist, formulates. The place to start is with a book like Gershom Scholem's book, Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, although it's quite difficult. So there are other books. I don't think it's a sort of, in England, we have a thing called Marmite. Do you know what that is? It's a very, it's a spread that's made of yeast. It's very sharp. You either love it or you hate it. That's not the way to deal with mysticism. The way to deal with mysticism is with a discerning palate. How much does this really teach me about the God of Scripture? How much of this is a different philosophical system? And I would actually be in line with a lot of what Mark Kinzer's thinking as well, that the mystical tradition is actually grasping for elements of who God is, who the Messiah is, that we as believers in Yeshua have had revealed to us in a special way already. And so it's a path of exploring the divine. It's a path with a lot of wisdom, a lot of theosophy, a whole system of theology in it. But I'm not as negative about it as I was when I first became a disciple of Yeshua. And I also think that there's some truth there that really helps us. So find yourself a teacher, find yourself a fellow student. Daniel Matt's new translation of the Zohar in Hebrew and English is, have you got all the volumes?
How many are there? I think I got 12.
There you go. You start studying these things. The rabbis say you shouldn't do it until you're 40 and you're married and you're stable. But people start earlier. I don't know how old you are. You're probably not yet there.
Not quite.
Yeah. So I think it's also about the way we see Jewish tradition and our faith in Yeshua. And again, some Messianic Jews I discovered have very little regard for the Jewish religious tradition unless it's directly confirmed by the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament. But I think I would take a different view, that I mustn't use my own reading of the New Testament to project back into Jewish mysticism, Rather, I've got to understand it in its own terms first. I've met a number of Messianic mystics in the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox community who are Yeshua believers. And of course, Christians used Kabbalah from the late Middle Ages to try and prove the messiahship of Jesus.
Yeah.
Pico de la Mirandola, he said, nothing can prove the divinity of Christ more effectively than Kabbalah and magic. And you can tell from that he's already quite esoteric. But
Wow.
and I wrote in my book on Messianic theology, I did have a whole section on Jewish mystical Christology, I called it. I'm not sure it really works because you're often being rather polemical and argumentative, and you're in danger of taking things out of context. But on the other hand, the speculations about the 10 aspects of God, the Sephirot, Trinity is not enough. You need 10 aspects in Kabbalah. So
Yeah.
it makes you think about this.
Yeah, I think it is worth thinking about.
It brings you in touch with your own Jewish history and tradition. We can't really understand Jewish people today or ourselves without being aware of the tremendous impact of that. And even, Zionism and even things like that are birthed from some of these understandings, even though a lot of the early Zionists were atheists.
Yeah. Another fun little point of contact there that I thought of was Elijah Ben Moseg, who wrote Israel and Humanity, a Sephardic rabbi in Italy, I think during the 1800s. And he wrote about the early Christian movement, the apostles. And he's like, they might have been on the right track, but you're not allowed to say this stuff. The stuff that they're saying is like, that's the sort of thing that you only talk about behind closed doors, and they're shouting it from the rooftops. So it seems like what he saw in like the Gospel of John was, well, this is Jewish mysticism. You can't write it down. What were they thinking?
So the Kabbalistic commentaries on the Gospels by Lichtenstein and Johannes Kemper of Krakow Levitov also was doing some of this in Love and the Messianic Age. They are really saying that these traditions fit together. And of course, from the late Middle Ages, the early modern period, the reception of Kabbalah in the Christian world, and then the way that Jews, even in the ghettos, were being influenced, like Salomon de Rosset, he's writing Hebrew song, he's writing the Kaddish prayer, setting it to the music of Italian classical polyphony. So there's a lot of cultural interchange. And the Sabbatian movement, which was the followers of Shabtai Tzvi, a particular expression of Jewish mysticism that took on a this worldly, political movement across Europe, that influences Christians and Jews backwards and forwards. You have people in the middle, like the conversos, like Uriel da Costa. So we can't say that they were hermetically sealed. In fact, this hermetic tradition of Jews who were interested in Christianity and Christians who were interested in Judaism and groups who were in between, like the followers of Jacob Frank and Shabtai Tzvi, they were all reading each other's books. And then some of them invented their own new ways of expressing their identities.
Yeah. The more I read about Jewish history, because I was looking back to see what like Reimarus writing about the like Jesus not trying to start a new religion. I'm like, what else was going on there? Like, how did he get there? And just before you dig too deep, you start already hearing the echoes of Shabbatai Tzvi. Like that was really a huge deal for like everybody in Europe. It's like wild, and there's like very few people talk about it. But it's incredibly impactful historical event.
Absolutely. And modern European nationalism, for example, Polish nationalism, was almost copying or influenced by the romantic high expectations of the movement that Shabtai Tzvi started, even though he converted to Islam and it failed. So,
Yeah.
yeah, the Jewish mystical tradition, hand in hand with the Jewish rationalist tradition, kept the Jewish communities surviving in hostile Christian Europe quite often, and then led to what we would now call modernity, with nationalism and romanticism, and with the sort of political programs that then have created the modern world. So Reimarus, David Strauss, these others, they're writing lives of Jesus in a Protestant or even a Catholic world, which tries to distance themselves from Judaism in many ways. I heard Paula Fredrickson give an excellent paper on, the Jewish lives of Jesus and early Christian lives of Jesus. But in fact, you cannot do this. And one of the reasons why Europe has gone the way it has, and America as well, is we've lost sight of the Jewishness of Yeshua and the Jewishness of the church. So Messianic Jews are in a special role, as is First Fruits of Zion, to try and bring those things back together.
Yeah. 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 And with God's help, we want that's sort of like the first book I wrote was Yeshua Matters. And it's we got to restore the vision of the Jewish Jesus, because if you got some other Jesus in there that you're following, you're just going to go in that direction, right? You're not going to be going in the right direction. So, all right. So I think we're about out of time, but let us know here at the end, what's next for you? What are you working on right now? And, if you have a Twitter account that you want people to follow, now's the time to disclose that.
Oh, thank you. Well, I have a mapping Messianic. No, I have a On This Day in Messianic Jewish History blog. And I set myself the task of writing something every day for about 3 years on what happened on this day that affected Messianic Jews or Messianic Jews were part of. And I'm just beginning to do that more regularly. I've got a number of writing projects. I'm trying to write a history to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the International Hebrew Christian Alliance, which has now become the International Messianic Jewish Alliance, 1925 to 2025. So that hopefully I'll get done this year. I'm writing and teaching in all sorts of contexts. So the major product would be something like a 1-volume Messianic Jewish theology of my own, but I think I'm still too young to do that. I'm still trying to learn so much. But other projects are the 1-volume history of the Alliance. I'm trying to follow up on the Luther and the Jews project as well. That's still ongoing. And any aspects of Messianic Jewish theology are things that interest me. And I'd like to see the field more fully developed, really. We have lots of good people studying and training. We need more people writing and teaching as well.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. All right. Well, this has been fascinating. I've learned a lot. I hope everybody listening has learned a lot. Thank you so much for being on the podcast, Dr. Richard Harvey.
Great to be with you. Great to meet you, Jacob. Thank you for all you're doing.
You're quite welcome. Thank you. Well, thanks for joining us today on Messiah Podcast. If you're interested in learning more about the Jewish Jesus, check out First Fruits of Zion at ffoz.org. And if you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening. Messiah Podcast is made possible by the generosity of our First Fruits of Zion friends. FFOZ friends are people like you who support our mission and get loads of exclusive Bible commentary, teaching, and content. You can join today at ffoz.org. Tune in next time for more great conversations. Until then, I'm Jacob Franzak. Shalom.
Let his word cover you and me, like the waters cover the sea. cover you and me. Like the waters cover the sea.